Thanks, guys. Bye, kids. Morning, how we doing? It's good to see you all. Happy Father's Day, gentlemen. If you came this morning hoping to hear Pastor Roy, I'm not Pastor Roy. Pastor Roy and Q, along with a bunch of leaders and a whole bunch of students, I think somewhere north of 50 of them in total are, as Levi mentioned earlier, in New Mexico. They're in Santa Rosa right now, and they'll be later this morning, early this afternoon, making their way to the Navajo reservation. So please continue to lift them up in prayer throughout this week. They'll begin serving tomorrow, I guess officially, doing Vacation Bible School in the morning, and they'll be doing some nightly meetings, worship services, that kind of thing. So keep them in your prayers. I know several of you, I'm sure, probably who are here this morning maybe have some students who are a part of that trip, or a spouse who's a part of that trip. Our third daughter, Cameron, is there for the first time. This morning, several years ago, got to go to the reservation when I was at First Baptist Church Howe. We went 4 or 5 years with Grace Bible, and so I'm excited for her. And then our second oldest, Kira, we've never done this before, so we dropped off Cameron here yesterday morning. They left about 7 a.m., and then we took our second oldest, Kira, to Gainesville, to the Whataburger on 35 in Gainesville, and we handed her off to 10 people we've never met before, and they took her to Cambodia. So right now, she is on a plane bound for Cambodia. They flew from here to Qatar to Bangkok, Thailand, and at some point will be arriving in Cambodia, and she'll be there for almost a couple of weeks on a short-term mission trip. So it's just me, as far as kids go, me and Colt and Elisha. So if you've got some kids you want to offload to me today, I'm feeling a little out of place. All my girls are gone. Lizzie's at school in Canyon, but we'll make the most of it. If this is your first time here in a while, or for perhaps ever, welcome. Thank you for being here this morning. This is now our third week in our summer series over the life of Joseph. Pastor Roy, a couple of weeks ago, began this series for us. We began with Joseph in his father's house. He's a young man. He's one of the younger children, the second youngest children, belonging to Jacob. Jacob's got a couple of wives, and a whole lot of crazy, unfortunate events have transpired, have unfolded within the life of that family. Joseph is favored by his father. Joseph begins to dream dreams, maybe out of naivety, I don't know, but over breakfast, he begins to share with his brothers and his father these dreams that he had about them bowing down to him, and it causes his brothers to respond with pride and jealousy. So they take Joseph, they throw him in a pit. Some of them want to kill Joseph, but one of them has a cooler head that prevails, and so he sees a traveling band of Ishmaelites coming on the horizon, and they say, let's just sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites. They take Joseph to Egypt, and once he is in Egypt, he's purchased by Potiphar. He becomes a slave. He's placed in Potiphar's home, and then rather quickly he begins to, everything that Joseph touches in that house begins to flourish, and the Lord is blessing that. And so Potiphar just continues to elevate Joseph time and time again within his home. He places Joseph, a slave, over the care of his finances and other people in his home. But the problem becomes, as Pastor Roy talked about last week, Potiphar has a wife, Potipharah, and she takes a liking to young, strapping Joseph. He's probably around 17 or so at the time. And she sees in him something that she doesn't have. She begins to desire him and tries to entice and seduce him. But Joseph, time and time again, thwarts her advances and pushes back against that. And then one day she's had enough, and she lays hold of him, and he runs out of the house, leaving his cloak behind. And so she concocts a story that he tried to take advantage of her, and that ultimately, as we just read, as Victoria read for us, and we'll read some of those verses again here in just a moment, that led to his being placed in prison by Potiphar. we're going to spend most of our time in chapter 40 this morning. In chapter 40, if you've read ahead, if you're familiar with the story, is a tough chapter because our guy find him in prison, and then it ends with Joseph still in prison. This is not a Father's Day message per se, but as I was planning this message and praying through this message, I certainly had some dads in mind. I had some men in mind. If you're familiar with what it feels like to carry a burden, this message is for you this morning. If you've ever said to yourself, I feel trapped, I feel stuck, it feels like the waiting is never going to come to an end, this message is for you. Certainly, the points of application that I'm going to share with us this morning, I promise you that they come out of the overflow of some things that have transpired in my life over the past few years. But I've never been to prison, praise God. My dad's here this morning. I won't go into all the details. There probably was a time during my high school years when I deserved to go to prison, but we won't go into all of that. I've never been to an Egyptian prison. So I can't, identify precisely with everything that has befallen Joseph, but I do know what it's like to feel like all hope is lost, as do some of you. I know what it's like for the enemy to whisper lines and into our ears that we might as well just give up. That it's never going to get any better. And what I hope you hear from the outset this morning is this. When those times come, when you feel stuck, when you feel trapped, like you feel like it's never going to get better, that God is still in control. That God is near. He has a plan. He's going to keep his promises for you, for us, for his children. He's going to see us through. That's who he is. There's a saying that goes something, and I don't know who the original author of the saying was, but someone once said something like, before God can use a man greatly, he must first break him greatly. And so we're going to see here Joseph waiting in agony. He's going to have to endure for a long time. But God's going to use it all for his glory and for the good of Joseph and for the good of ultimately an entire nation. So there's a point to the waiting. I've got for us this morning 4 points from the text that we're going to read, the latter part of chapter 39 and then chapter 40. And I pray that these points of application, that there'll be something that you can recall, that you can remind yourself of when you find yourself in the thick of the waiting. Here's point number 1. In the waiting, serve. In the waiting, as you're waiting upon the Lord, determine to serve the Lord. Let's go back. Chapter 39, once more, verse 20. Joseph is in prison at this point. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's seeking to be faithful to his master. Joseph's master took him, put him into prison, and the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison, so impressed with Joseph's acumen, his abilities, the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was done in Joseph's charge. But here's that refrain once more. Because the Lord was with him, everything that he did, the Lord made it succeed. Now, if I'm Joseph, if I'm placed in prison for not doing anything wrong, I've just been about my business, my brothers trafficked me, they sold me into slavery, I got to a land, a place, a nation that I had never previously known, but I tried to do my best there to honor the Lord. I served my master well, and then I'm transferred to prison. If that's me, I'm finding the deepest, darkest corner of that prison to just hide in, right? I'm not trying to do my best. I'm not trying to work hard. I'm mad. I'm going to sulk. I'm going to pout. I'm going to whine. I'm going to argue with the guards. I'm going to distance myself from the other inmates. But that's not the course that Joseph takes. He just picks up right where he left off in Potiphar's home. Though it didn't really work out in his favor in Potiphar's home, he just continues to serve the Lord. He continues to use the gifts and the abilities that God has blessed him with to make a difference in that particular setting, in prison. The Lord is with him. Verse 21, the Lord is with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. Because the Lord was with Joseph, Joseph sought to bring God glory in that dark place, a place that he would not have chosen for himself. He was going to bring God glory there. There's some similarities between this story, what's happened to Joseph, and what would happen to Daniel. If you're familiar with the story of Daniel, check it out. If you haven't, if you're not familiar with it, read that book. It's wonderful. It'll encourage you. Daniel was a teenager, along with some of his friends, many friends, but the three that we know of are Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. They're in Israel, and God allowed a foreign nation, Babylon, to come into Israel because of the rampant idolatry that was taking place in Israel. God warned them, and God said, hey, you need to stop doing this. You're to worship me only. You're to bow down to me only. You're to serve me only. But they just continued to turn their backs on the Lord and to run after things that were false. And so eventually God raised up a foreign power, Babylon, led by Nebuchadnezzar, to go into Israel, the southern kingdom, and to lay siege to it. And the Babylonians attacked over a series of events. And that first wave, during that first wave, the Babylonians took the sons of the nobility out, and they took them back to Babylon, essentially to reprogram them, to reculture them, so that they could become leaders in Babylon. And Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego were some of those boys, kidnapped from their homeland. And when they get to where they're eventually going, Babylon, Daniel, and those guys, they continue to serve the Lord. They continue to seek God first. And we're told in chapter 2 of Daniel and chapter 5 that God, it's almost the exact same language that the Lord blessed, and the Lord gave favor to Daniel and to those other young men because they sought the Lord. That's what Joseph did. In the waiting, serve God. I have a picture of a gentleman that I want you to see. This is a man named John Bunyan. Not Paul Bunyan with the ox, but John Bunyan. This guy lived in the 1600s and lived in England. I love his story. I love John Bunyan, and I could spend hours telling you about John Bunyan, but I've got to condense his life in just a few minutes, which is going to be a struggle for me. John Bunyan was a poor man, was not well trained, only had about a 5th or a 6th grade education. His father was what's called a tinker, and that's what John Bunyan became. A tinker is somebody who hammered dents out of pots, and he would fix broken pot handles back to the pot. That's what he did. Much of his life was marked by rebellion and sinfulness and cursing and lying and debauchery. But at the age of 25, he was living in this town called Bedford outside of, or in England, outside of London. And he was married to his first wife at the time. She would eventually pass away. And he was in this town, and he overheard the story goes, 3 ladies having a spiritual conversation about the Lord that piqued his interest. And he just was just listening. And he began to listen more, and he would find himself listening to, on future days, listening to what they had to say. And they eventually introduced him to their pastor, a man named John Gifford. And over a series of days, weeks, months, John Bunyan and John Gifford met with each other, and John Bunyan was led to the Lord at the age of 25. And very quickly, he begins to preach. He becomes a deacon in this church, St. John's Church. He begins to preach. At the time in England, at this particular time in England, they were enjoying religious freedom. You could preach and not have to be a part of the Church of England, but around 1660, the monarchy was restored in England. And a guy named Charles II comes to power, and he removes religious freedom from the land. You had to, if you were going to preach, you had to be registered with the state. If you were going to pray, you had to pray prayers that were written in this book of prayer. If you were going to preach, you had to preach messages that were endorsed by the state. But John Bunyan didn't like that. He was what's called an independent or a nonconformist. They were removed from their church, he and his congregation, removed from their church because they weren't registered with the state. So they begin to meet in a barn. And then they get kicked out of the barn, so they begin meeting in a stable. They get kicked out of the stable, they begin meeting in a cow shed. And in that place, the local magistrates, the local authorities hear about what John Bunyan is continuing to do, so they send men to arrest him, take him to prison. And he eventually taken to prison. He's meeting with these local authorities, these magistrates, and they're warning him, you need to stop preaching. You're guilty. You have not registered with the state. And so the punishment is 3 months. And after 3 months, if you do not cease from your preaching or register with the state, you'll be banished from the realm. And John Bunyan told them that if you release me from prison today, I will preach the gospel tomorrow. He remained in prison for 12 years. And the story goes that they never locked the door. That they told him, you can come, you can leave whenever you want to. Just stop preaching the gospel. Register with the state. Pray our prayers. Preach our sermons. And he refused to do that. He said, I will stay in prison until the moss covers my eyes rather than disobey God. And I tell you all of that. You might be wondering, what does that have to do with serving the Lord? While he's in prison, he provided for his family by making shoelaces for boots and shoes. He wasn't skilled enough to actually make the boots himself, so he just toils away at making shoelaces in order to provide for his family. And not only did he do that, but while he's in prison, he begins to write. He had 3 books while he was in prison. He had the Bible, he had a commentary, and Fox's Book of Martyrs. He just begins to, and he was already doing this prior to being in prison, but he just begins to just study the scriptures and read the scriptures. Charles Spurgeon said of John Bunyan that if you pricked him anywhere, he would bleed bibline, which is like Bible blood. He would just start, he oozed Jesus. And so he just begins to pour over the scriptures, and then he begins to write. The first book that he writes in prison is a book on spiritual prayer, just praying in the Spirit, not praying what the state tells you to pray, but just praying as the Spirit would so lead. But then later on, towards the end of his prison sentence, they eventually just gave up on the guy and let him out of prison for a few years, and then they rearrest him, and he spends 4 more years in prison. And during that second prison stint, he writes a book that is the second most published book in all of human history, The Pilgrim's Progress. If you've never read The Pilgrim's Progress, I would highly, highly encourage you to do it. Within 200 years of John Bunyan's death, it is said that every household in England had at least 2 books, the Bible and The Pilgrim's Progress. This morning in the Connect Central room, we've got I think it's 10 copies of that book. If you want to pick one up, it will encourage you. The Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory. It starts with a man, though he never names himself, John Bunyan, a man in prison who dreams a dream of a man named Christian who goes on a spiritual journey. He leaves the city of destruction and ultimately finds himself in the celestial city. And there's all kinds of pitfalls and temptations along the way. Charles Spurgeon said of The Pilgrim's Progress, Spurgeon said that he read Pilgrim's Progress over 100 times throughout his life. And he says that when you read Pilgrim's Progress, you can't read it and not smell the stench of the prison. When John Bunyan was in prison, he didn't whine, he didn't complain, he didn't compromise, he didn't give up on his God, he didn't try to shortchange things. He said, here's what I'm going to do. This is not what I would have chosen for myself, but I'm going to seek to bring God glory in the waiting. hey, right now, this morning, I know you're not in a prison in Egypt. I know you're not in a prison in Grayson County, but maybe right now there's some things happening in your life that have you a little bit befuddled or disgruntled. Maybe you don't like your job. Maybe you don't like where you live. Maybe there's something about your circumstances that if you had it your way, you would change in a moment. But maybe instead of complaining and whining and saying, I quit, maybe we should say, God, how can I bring you glory in this place? I've had to learn that lesson. It's hard, right? If we were God, we would change things for ourselves, but we would make a mess of things, I'm sure. But what if we said, God, you have me planted here. You have me living here. You have me surrounded by these people right now. How can I bring you glory in this? Second point this morning, in the waiting, show compassion. In the waiting, show compassion. Chapter 40, verse 1. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker, this is where it starts to get a little weird, committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody, and one night they both dreamed, and the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house. Here's the question: why are your faces downcast today? And they said to him, we have had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them. We'll pause there. Joseph's in prison, working hard, receiving blessing, receiving accommodation. He's being promoted in prison. He's like the assistant warden in prison, and that goes on for a number of years. We don't know exactly, but that's his case for quite some time. And then one day, lo and behold, the cupbearer and the baker and the candlestick maker, these guys come into the prison. We don't know exactly what they've done wrong that has irked the Pharaoh, but they've done something, or they've been found guilty of something, and they've been placed in that particular prison. And when they show up, everything changes for Joseph. He's like the number two, but when they show up, the head warden says to Joseph, hey, now your job is to attend to these guys. Now you become their servant. Again, if I'm Joseph, I'm like, man, I've been doing well. Like I've been given responsibility and privileges that come along from keeping those responsibilities. And now I'm like back down at the bottom of the totem pole again. I've got to serve the cupbearer and the baker. These were high-ranking governing officials. The cupbearer had a really important job. It was his responsibility to taste the king's wine or the Pharaoh's wine or other things that he enjoyed before he consumed them himself. These are high-ranking dudes. And on one particular night, we don't know how much time has transpired, but on one morning, everybody wakes up, and Joseph looks at those two guys, the cupbearer and the baker, and he sees that they're unhappy, that they've got the sads. And Joseph could have easily just looked the other direction, minded his own business, mad, sad, frustrated with his circumstances, with his condition, with his lot in life. But instead, he looks at those two guys. He sees that they're upset. He sees that their countenance has changed. And he inquires, hey, why are your faces downcast? And then he's going to move intentionally. And he's not using this as an opportunity to promote himself. This is not about manipulation. I believe that Joseph was genuinely 100% concerned and moved with compassion to seek to help these guys. Had he not done that, had Joseph just looked the other way, he would have missed an opportunity to be a blessing to at least one of them. We'll get to the interpretation of their dream in a moment. I think we have an incredible example of this in the person of Jesus Christ. When we find ourselves enduring, in the waiting, struggling, not liking what's going on around us, we are absolutely called to show compassion. That's what Jesus did. Jesus left the glory of heaven. He came and lived in a broken and dark world, a world filled with sin. And Matthew tells us in Matthew chapter 9, I think beginning in verse 35, that when Jesus saw the crowds one day, early in his ministry, he was moved with compassion for them. He saw that they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And that would define the course of the entirety of Jesus' ministry. Moved with compassion, all the way to the cross. You know the story of the cross. Luke chapter 23 tells us that after Jesus was arrested and betrayed into the hands of angry men, after he's been led from this place to be tried to that place, that all of that goes on. He's mocked, he's spat upon, he's whipped, he has a crown of thorns placed upon his head, he's placed on a cross, and on that cross, hanging adjacent to him on either side of him, are two criminals. And Luke tells us that one of those criminals begins to rail against Jesus, begins to mock him. Hey, if you're the Christ, if you're the Messiah, if you're the one that we've all been waiting for, then set yourself free. Get us out of here. And then there's another criminal who begins to chastise that first criminal, tells him to shut up. And he says, hey, we deserve to be here. We are guilty of our crimes. We've stolen. We've hurt people. But he's done nothing wrong. And then that criminal, the second criminal, says to Jesus, will you remember me when you go into your kingdom? And Jesus has been through it all at this point. It hasn't just been a rough day or a rough weekend for him, but the entirety of his life has been marked by hardship and pain. And you would think if Jesus was just a man in that moment, he would just say, enough, stop, I don't want to hear it anymore. I'm hurting, I'm bleeding, my body's broken, it's been opened up. But Jesus in that moment still has compassion. And he says to that unnamed thief, he says, today you will be with me in paradise. He extends grace. In the waiting, in the painful seasons of waiting that we will experience throughout our lives, we need to take care that we don't do a couple of things. Number one, we need to make sure that we don't become so hyper-focused on ourselves that we miss people who are hurting around us. We probably have all done that. We probably have all been guilty of that at some point in time. We get so focused on our pain, our hurt, our circumstances that we miss the fact that God has sovereignly placed us around other people who are going through battles of their own. Think about somebody at work, maybe the guy at work or the person at work who's so disappointed that they didn't land the sale or get the promotion that they've been working so hard for. They're so upset. They're so frustrated that they miss the fact that a coworker, the next cubicle over, is going through hardship in his or her marriage. Or that somebody else down the hallway that they work with has cancer or something like that. That we're so focused myopically upon ourselves that we miss the fact there are people around us who need Jesus. In the waiting, show compassion. Second, in the waiting, let's not become hurt people who hurt people. Let's not use our hurt, our pain, that is real and legitimate. I'm not casting shade on any of that. Real pain that we're experiencing as an excuse to return volley and to hurt other people. How many of us have had something happen during the course of our day at work, or maybe something that happened to us on the road, like some sort of weird incident, something that happened to us at a restaurant, and then we go home and we ventilate all of that to the people who are closest to us, our spouses and our children, our neighbors, church members, because of something that's happened during the course of the week. Maybe, just maybe, in our hurt, during our prolonged seasons of waiting, again, God has sovereignly placed people around us that we need to minister to. With trembling hands, with shaky knees, just to say, hey, I'm going through it too. But I'm trusting the Lord. My gaze is set. My eyes are fixed on the Lord. We can encourage people. We can love people. We can show compassion to people during those times. Thirdly, this morning, in the waiting, remember the sovereignty of God. In the waiting, remember the sovereignty of God. Verse 9. So the chief cupbearer, let me back up real fast to verse 8 once more. They said to him, we've had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. That's a really important verse. We'll come back in just a moment. 9. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, in my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And then Joseph said to him, this is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days, and in 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly. And when you were his cupbearer, only remember me. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so go get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit. And when the chief cupbearer saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, and this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days, and in 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you, sever your head, and hang you on a tree. And I don't know why he had to add this last part. And the birds will eat the flesh from you. That's bold. He just gives them the interpretation. In the waiting, remember the sovereignty of God. These guys have dreams. They're distressed. They're struggling. Joseph sees that, and he points them to the supremacy of God. We've had dreams, and there's nobody here to interpret our dreams. If Joseph was a selfish individual, a self-seeking individual, he would have seized an opportunity to say, hey, I'm Joseph. I've got some experience with some dreams. I've dreamed some dreams, and I can interpret your dreams. I've interpreted my dreams. But that's not what he does. During this particular time in Egypt, as Pastor Roy pointed out a couple of weeks ago, they gave a lot of attention, a lot of credit to dreams. There were whole entire schools and volumes of works that were devoted to interpreting dreams. Joseph could have said, hey, in Egypt, this is what this would mean, but he doesn't point to himself. He doesn't point to Egypt. He points them directly to the supremacy and to the sovereignty of God. And I believe that Joseph did that because in totality, Joseph believed in and embraced the sovereignty of God. Why do I say that? We don't have to turn there, but if you'll think back to chapter 39, verse 20, after Joseph, after in Potiphar's house, when Potiphar's wife loses her mind and accuses Joseph of seeking to take advantage of her, in that moment, Potiphar could have just had Joseph killed on the spot, right? If you're a slave in Egypt thousands of years ago, the state is not wasting resources on you, placing you in prison. You're just dead on the spot. Next man up. But Joseph knows that God is sovereign over his life, that God is doing something. He doesn't like it. He doesn't like his conditions. He's not asking for it. But Joseph recognizes, I should be dead. There's no lawyer guaranteed to him. There's no due process that is promised to Joseph. He's just a slave, but he's been placed in prison. He's been flourishing in prison. He knows that God is with him. He knows that this is all happening because of the sovereignty of God. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, the Apostle Paul wrote, Ephesians is a prison letter.
the Apostle Paul wrote. He said, I am, chapter 4, verse 1, I am a prisoner of the Lord. Meaning, the Lord, God's will, placed Paul in that Roman prison. And that's exactly what John Bunyan said 400-ish years ago. I'm a prisoner of the Lord. And that's how Joseph saw things. He couldn't understand the big picture of what was going to happen in the future, but he knew that this was all happening according to the divine will of God. When I talk about the sovereignty of God, what I'm referring to is this, that God is in control of all things. And by all things, I mean all things. The good things that come our way, God is Lord over those things. And what we would consider to be, from our limited perspective, to be quote-unquote bad things, God is Lord over that as well. He is the God who gives and the God who takes away. He's the God who brings us into existence. He ordains the number of our days. He calls us unto salvation, and He has, yes, appointed a day for us to die. And there's nothing that you or I can do to circumvent that. He is God. Let me share a quote with you. This is from R.C. Sproul. If God is not sovereign, God is not God. If there is one maverick molecule in the universe, one molecule running loose outside the scope of God's sovereign ordination, then, ladies and gentlemen, there is not the slightest confidence that you can have that any promise that God ever made about the future will come to pass. This is the God that we serve, the God that we worship, the all-powerful God of the universe. Charles Spurgeon said that the sovereignty of God is the soft pillow upon which the man of God rests his head at night, bringing perfect peace. In Genesis chapter 50, we'll get there eventually. Don't tell Pastor Roy that I spoiled the end of the story for you, okay? At the end of Joseph's life, he eventually gets out of prison. He gets elevated again. At the end of his life, as he's on his deathbed, he's got his brothers in front of him, and his brothers are struggling to see. They're struggling because of what they did to Joseph, and the turmoil, the fracture that occurred in their family as a result. And here's what Joseph says in chapter 50, verse 20 of Genesis. What you intended for evil, God meant for good. And the word that Joseph uses is not used. It's not God used all of this for good, but God meant it. It all had a point. None of the pit, Potiphar's house, the prison, the famine that we'll talk about in a few weeks, none of that took the God of the universe by surprise. Let that be an encouragement to you today. Whatever you're going through right now, whatever may befall you in the weeks and months and years to come, God is Lord of it all. When you're sitting in front of the doctor and he gives you or the one that you love so dearly a difficult health diagnosis, God is with you. He's in control. Whatever may happen in our country, God is Lord of it all. And so we can rest in Him. Amen? He's not off in the cosmos. There are some people who are called deists, and they believe that there's a God exists, and He started things, and He got things working, and now He's just kind of sitting back, kind of watching things unfold as they do. But that's not the God that we know. That is not our God. He is close to us. He's in control, and we can rest in that. Last point. I'm going over time. Last point. In the waiting, know that your rescue is coming. Know that your rescue is coming. Joseph says, hey, remember me. Remember me. Is what he says to the cupbearer. Verse 20, on the third day when which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearers and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief cupbearer as Joseph had interpreted to him. But here's a hard verse. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. This is when I lose it. All right, if I'm in Joseph's position, this is when I can't tolerate it anymore. If I've managed to hang in there and be patient, if I've persevered to this point, I'm losing my mind. Imagine Joseph day after day waking up, looking outside, peering through the prison bars, listening to see if there might be footsteps coming down the hallway, listening for the rattling of jail cell keys to let him out, thinking today's going to be the day. But day after day after day, years go by, he stays in prison. And we want this to be an American version of the story where the cupbearer goes free, and then here comes Pharaoh running down the hallway right away to set our hero free, but that's not the way it works. Years go by, but eventually his release would come. Continue to trust in the Lord. There will be some of us who will know this side of heaven, will know the joy that results from the prison doors flinging wide open. There will be some of us who will know what it feels like to get out of the pit. There will be some who will be transferred from the fiery furnace and released from the lion's den. But hear this, there will be some on this side of heaven who will die in those places. There will be some who cling to Jesus, who hope in the Lord steadfastly, and they will die in the pit. And they'll die with a disease, and they'll die never getting the promotion that they wanted. And in those moments, a world that rejects and is hostile to the Lord will laugh and mock and say, "What a waste." But when we die, if in those places, the scriptures tell us that in the twinkling of an eye, in an instant, we are transferred from this realm to the kingdom of heaven. Think about Stephen. In Acts chapter 7 and 8, Stephen the deacon who was ministering to widows and sharing about the kingdom of heaven. Angry men, the same angry religious men that arrested and tried Jesus and crucified Jesus, they came for Stephen. And they placed him in a pit. And they began to stone him by dropping these heavy boulders upon him, crushing his bones and tearing apart his flesh. And Stephen gazes up into heaven, sees the Lord in his glory. Dies in peace. Romans chapter 8, verse 18, Paul wrote, he said, "I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is going to be revealed to us." I don't know what you're going through right now. I don't know what this season looks like or what it may look like for us in the near or distant future. But I know that if our faith is in Jesus, there will be a rescue. There will be a glorious homecoming. It may come in this life, but it certainly will come in the next, when we will run into the arms of our King. I'm going to ask our praise team to come back up. Church, I pray that that's your testimony. I pray that you're not waiting in vain, but that you're waiting in Jesus, that you're waiting and resting confidently in the Lord. Let's pray. Holy God, I love you. And I thank you so much for what you've shown us this morning in your word. Lord, I know that it can be so tempting to think that there's no point to the waiting. I know it can be tempting to just get frustrated and to release anger into the ether and to shake our fists in dismay. But God, I pray that we would at all times remember that you are in control and you love us. You're for us. You're our Father. God, we may never know a prison in Egypt. And I pray that we would never know a literal prison, but God, we'll know what the pit feels like. It may be metaphorical, but we'll experience it. And I pray that we would cling to you in those places. May you use us in those places to advance the good news of Jesus Christ. God, right now, would you help us to imagine the person at work that we'll see tomorrow? Maybe a job that we don't want. Or person at school in a couple of months that we need to share the good news with. Not on our best day, not when everything's clicking for us, not when there's lots of money in the bank, not when our health is good, not when every car starts, but God, on our worst day, when it's a struggle, may we just take a deep breath and realize that you're God and we're not, and we're here to make much of Jesus. Would you do that? We love you and pray this in your Son's holy name. Let's stand and sing.